Welcome, everyone, to today's exciting conversation on developing agility as an organizational competency. I'm your host, Rafael DeLeon, Senior Vice President at Ncast, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend, Dave Coffaro. Dave is a strategic advisor, executive coach, keynote speaker, and author. His areas of expertise include delivering results, leading organizations in the process of strategy development and execution, change leadership, organizational transformation, and innovation. Dave serves as the principal of Strategic Advisory Consulting Group, and Dave works with service businesses, financial services, academic, insurance, professional service firms, and nonprofits in refining and redesigning their future state to achieve accelerating growth, more favorable economics, or both. His work also includes serving as interim CEO for organizations in transition. Dave is also published and has a number of articles and blogs that are published in SmartBrief on Leadership, the American Management Association Journal, Board Leadership, the ABA Banking Journal, to name a few. Dave is also the author, and his latest book is Leading from Zero: 7 Essential Elements to Earning Relevance. So we hope you will find this discussion to be insightful, and we hope that it promises to illuminate the essence of effective change leadership, especially needed in a rapidly evolving world. We need the ability to navigate and drive transformation. So I hope that this conversation will serve as a compass for all those that are seeking to thrive amidst the waves of change. So get ready to absorb some wisdom, insights, and practical strategy as we embark on our journey. Welcome, Dave.
Rafael, always enlightening to get to talk with you. And the topic itself is so engaging because it's the reality of the environment that we live in. It's always evolving, always dynamic. I think often about just the fact that the earth spins at 1,000 miles an hour every moment of every day. And kind of the reality that imbues is that things are always moving. So I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you.
Likewise. So let's get started. Let's jump into answering the leadership call. And why is this important for us to know?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that this whole notion of leadership, who leaders are. And in fact, my perspective is that we're all leaders. Whatever your role is in an organization, there is a dimension of leadership. I do not support the old notion that it's just the CEO or the president or the head of the company or the head of the team. Those are roles. But the opportunity to play a role, leadership, to show up as a leader, is present for everyone. So I think it applies to everybody within an organization. What it really means is it's the way that we show up through the choices that we make, through the ideas that we bring to bear. Think about it, Rafael. In your role and my role, so much of it is about ideas, bringing new ideas that are going to help advance the mission of the organization, to serve your clients, to serve your customers, to serve your team members. And so part of leadership that's so essential is that presenting ideas that can help influence and advance the organization. It's actions versus being a superhero. So there's this perspective of the leader as the one who's wearing the superhero outfit and saves the day and, avoids crises and things like that. That's not leadership. That's a firefighter. We do need firefighters, but these other descriptions, I think, are much more relevant in terms of what it means to be a leader. Another thing that's so important, I think, for all leaders is to capitalize on competencies, to continually ask the question, what do I do really well? What do I contribute to the organization? And what does the organization, the institution, do really well? And what do we contribute to our community, to society? So often I work with organizations that step into an activity. Maybe they make an acquisition or they go off into providing a product or a service that's outside of what their competencies are. It doesn't mean you can never, ever do that, but you're better to build on your strengths and build from your strengths. And also know when you need to bring in a partner who can augment what you do well. Think about how complex financial services are today. The regulatory environment is so dynamic. It's hard to know all. It's hard to know everything. So finding that partner that can really excel every minute of every day, that's what they're thinking about, versus you think about it as things come up. Then being attuned and adaptive is another part of answering the leadership call. And what I mean by that, Rafael, is it's that ability to be looking out at the world around us, identifying things that are really evident or things that are starting to crop up and say, what does this mean to us? What does this mean to me? How does this impact our organization? How is it going to impact the way we serve our customers, our clients, our team members? And then being adaptive, being agile. And I know we're going to talk more about that. But that leads to sort of this last point that's bold here, which is to recognize that change leadership is the business. There's this great saying from Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, and I think it was like 400 BC or something like that. I'll paraphrase, excuse me, but it's something like, no one can set foot in the same river twice, because the river's always changing and the person's always changing. And so, the whole notion that change is the only constant, to me, that feels like it's static. And then something changes and then we deal with it. I don't think that's a reality. I think that as leaders, our call is to recognize that leading ourselves, leading our organizations through this dynamic environment that's always in motion is the business we're in. It's not something we do on the side. It's not something we just call a consultant in to help us with. It's what we do. How does that land on you?
It sits right well with things that I've spoken about and examples that I've seen, especially starting with the leadership call from within. I have a story that I'll quickly share with you, that there was a young woman that I knew that she was not the compliance officer. She worked on as a part of a team. And she had really no training, a formal training in, management or leadership, and was kind of learning risk management. But she noticed some inefficiencies in the company's current risk assessment process. And being passionate about it, just started researching and evaluating and then analyzing their existing systems and talking to her boss. And her boss said, yeah, why don't you proceed with this and give me a proposal, give me your thoughts. And, I think, and their boss, she later candidly told me, boss thought I was just going to give her 2 or 3 bullet points, but I kind of laid out a scenario and her boss was very impressed. Well, her proposal was eventually implemented. It led to significant improvements in the risk assessment process for this individual bank. And so her initiative, and that's what you're kind of talking about, it's that initiative, that's that passion and dedication that are really part of those competencies, impacted the company's bottom line, but also demonstrated her and her leadership qualities and abilities. So, I look at that as one example, but as we look at the rapidly changing world, just looking at the events that we've seen so far this past year, with, banks' failure and how quickly that changed, and that's a wake-up call for how we look at things and how we do things, to these horrific fires, wildfires that have impacted, that all of a sudden, give us pause to, well, things aren't as static as they used to be. It's very dynamic. And so it gets into a lot of, areas that we're talking about. So thanks for framing that. And so what I'd really like to talk about next is, what is organizational agility?
So this concept is sort of an element of change leadership. It's this idea, and this applies to people in any leadership role, individual contributors, C-suite, whomever, and all team members in an organization. But it's this concept that, first of all, we're attuned to continually evolving conditions within the organization. So this is sort of the inside out view. What's happening with us, with everyone on our team, with our processes, with our effectiveness, with our efficiency? How have things changed? Maybe we've got to change in our suppliers. Maybe we've got to change in our technology, our tools, our platforms, whatever the conditions are, it's something within the business that is evolving. And then it's also monitoring, and here I'm using the terms intentionally, subtle, gradual, rapid, or event-driven external environmental shifts. So, Rafael, the unfortunate fires in Maui is a perfect example of an event-driven situation. My brother is in the commercial lighting business. His partner in Oahu canceled a series of contractor sessions they had. Maui is one of the islands, but because they need to apply all their resources to help deal with the relief and the rebuilding. So that's an event-driven thing that's affecting their business. Certainly it's affected a lot of lives, and that's the most important thing. But that's an example of taking that outside in view and seeing what that might mean to the organization. But then this is where it really becomes valuable. It's inferring what these environmental dynamics, the things going on within and outside of the company, what do they mean to us? What does it tell us? What are the things we should be thinking about, not just for today, but tomorrow, the next day, and beyond? And then from there, adapting and adjusting our actions. So that can be things like just our processes may need to be tweaked in some way. It might mean that we need to realign our resource allocation. We may need to have some people doing different roles, or we may need to refocus our tools, our processes, and so forth. And we may have to take a look at our overall operating model. Now, one of my philosophies, and I've shared this with you before, Rafael, but is that every operating model, our go-to-market model for the bank, for the institution, it's got a finite shelf life. It doesn't last forever because the environment is always changing. So I always get worried when I see a bank that says we've been in business for 120 years. Okay, that's good. Longevity is a really good thing. But then the next question is, how has your operating model evolved? And if it hasn't been refined, redesigned, re-examined since COVID started, it's probably time. So I think that's an important element too. The last element of organizational agility is to recognize that change leadership, it's not an overlay. It is the business we're in. So I'm repeating this again because it's such an important thing. There's this perspective that people often have in companies, and I, as a banker, someone who spent a lot of my career in banking, I can say it, I've lived it, to just sort of get into this, yeah, but this is the way our systems work. This is the way our tools, this is what our policy manual says. This is the way that we've passed our exams in the past. That all matters, but it may not matter as much as the environment changes around us. So that's sort of an initial definition. I want to also share, so this is my definition, but one that I like. And before I even came up with my definition, if I found this one, I would have just used this, but this is from McKinsey, and I think it's terrific. They talk about organizational agility as the ability to quickly reconfigure strategy, structure, processes, people, and technology toward value creating and value protecting opportunities. I think that's a beautiful definition. Does that resonate with sort of where you are and you're thinking about this?
Very much so. And if you'll go back to the previous slide, there's some things that I want to touch on, but I think the quote there sums it up perfectly. And I would say the need for this has exponentially grown as we've seen the rapid pace of digitization within all of our economies, but certainly within financial institutions, where there's a very clear line of demarcation before COVID and since COVID. And what happened to banks that they had to move very quickly into that. We had an event-driven scenario, and everybody was impacted and had to move very quickly. And that rate of change has happened exponentially. But I think, again, looking at those implications, what are they for our systems? Because we've got, and you've been in financial services long enough, legacy core systems that have been there that is really like kind of trying to connect an analog world to a digital world and bolting the two together. And those organizations that are really differentiating themselves are recreating those systems to be up to speed, to be more in the digital age, not just to kind of get a pass through. And I realize that's very cost and labor intensive, but if you're not looking at those things, as you said, where do we need to be in 3, 5, or 10 years? You're almost kind of fighting a lost cause.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, if you want to start seeing emotion out of bankers, you just ask them how much they like their core system. Doesn't matter what area of banking they're in. It could be the wealth. It could be in commercial or retail. That's going to get people going. It's going to get them charged. But then you look at what's going on around us, which I think creates a really good tension in a way. And that's, in a sense, what agility is about, is we've got this outside tension because we've got these fintechs who don't understand the legacy baggage, and they shouldn't. They're the ones coming up with the new ideas and saying, try this. Now, it doesn't always work. It may not fit the risk scheme of the institution, but the good thing is it's that the external kind of the subtle, gradual, rapid environmental shifts, because even though it doesn't happen today, it may tomorrow or the next day in a different iteration. I love the whole notion of ideation, and there's this perception that somebody has this light bulb moment and something new happens. In reality, it's never that way. Take the electric vehicle. Tesla now, the Model Y is the world's best-selling vehicle. That didn't happen overnight. I believe it was in the 1890s. There was a car called the Morrison, if I'm not mistaken. It had a range of like maybe 10 miles or something, top speed of 14 miles an hour, but it was one of the first electric vehicles. So iteration after iteration after iteration, and now this overnight sensation, the Model Y, that's the biggest selling car on the planet.
Well, again, talking about the implications of, the dynamics and businesses, what we're facing, just with financial institutions partnering with fintechs, and what are those implications for how consumers are going to be impacted by that? Before, we knew if we did business together, well, I trust Dave, and Dave's going to do the right thing. Well, Dave is well-being and well-meaning and well-intentioned, but may not be familiar with all the laws and regulations that are impacting me as a financial institution, that you may be doing something that if we're not working together and in tandem and trying to adjust that, even these fintechs, they may end up, harming consumers. And we've seen examples.
Yeah, but so look, I always see the good things that are evolving too, right? Not to be Pollyanna, but I love the fact that OCC created their Office of Innovation a couple of years ago, and it's an invitation to the fintech community to say, come on in, sit down, have a conversation with us. We want to know what you're doing. Not from we want to control it. It's we want to hear the ideas and the challenges, the problems you're trying to solve. And let's see how that fits with the ecosystem as we know it today. That's a really positive thing, because again, it gets back to this subtle, gradual, rapid, and event-driven shifts. Because these problems that are being tackled with fintechs, they're not new problems, they're old problems, but it's new ways to deal with it. And I really appreciate that one of the biggest regulators is taking a look and saying, we want to be on the cutting edge. We don't want to just wait till it's done. We want to hear early on. So I think that's an example of agility, though.
You kind of shared the example with me of Wayne Gretzky, skating to where the puck is.
Right.
And that was a very proud moment at the OCC where I could see, we're moving to where we're skating towards the puck is. We see these changes. And, the Office of Innovation was really launched by Tom Curry during his tenure. That was 7, 8 years ago that we were looking at. And look how quickly things have evolved and changed, that they were starting to review this, take a look at this. The office was established. For me, that was a very proud moment that said, for a government agency, here's what we're doing to, be forward thinking and forward looking.
Right, right. I know for a lot of bankers, when you hear government agency, it doesn't necessarily mean welcoming and friendly. I think we got to get past that mindset. We really do. We're all working toward the same end. And I know from having run a highly regulated business, that when you can have open dialogue about the most important things. What are our clients seeing? What's changing about them? What are our partners doing? What's changing about them? And what does that mean to us? That can be really productive. It's, when you create that engagement, it's all about the relationship, and that ultimately helps you serve your stakeholders.
Well, I think it gets down to what we're going to move into next and kind of looking at things more holistically than we have in the past, because it really gets down into breaking down silos. And we keep talking about this, but this is happening in a lot of different ways. So talk a little bit about how you kind of see, the shift from organizations as machines to living organisms. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart, and I've spoken about to boards of directors over the past few years.
So you use the term breaking down silos, and I wish I could take credit for this graphic. This is not mine. This is also McKinsey's, and it's specific to this whole notion of organizational agility. But I love what they've done. So if you take a look on the left side, this top-down hierarchy, old-fashioned traditional structural model that anybody who went to business school studied, and think about what that means. You've got this rigid structure in an environment that is anything but rigid. There is no area of financial services that has not gone through either somewhat significant or extremely radical change in the last 3, 5, 10 years, right? And so the example on the right is this sort of concept that instead of a machine, that old, going back to the post-World War II and the Edwards Deming manufacturing concept, into this, okay, organizations are really living, breathing things. They're living, breathing organisms with people in them. And so when we can get past that sort of, I fit into this box, this is my cube, this is what I do concept, sort of what I was talking about earlier, this idea that everybody's eyes and ears on the terrain help us see things that maybe one person couldn't see. And that allows us to be quick in terms of change and flexible in terms of our resources. So the responsibility of senior people in the organization is to help show direction and enable action, but they recognize we work better when we're hearing, seeing, viewing the environment with all of our resources and not specifically based on our silos. How does that land on you?
It's very true, because as I would talk to boards of directors in the past, and I would see very kind of static board packages that were developed, and that the board packages would increase in volume because different regulatory exams would come through, and it's like, well, you need to have this a part of your board packet. Well, I know from my own prior experience, a lot of that came with depending on how the situation and the times around you were changing. It didn't mean that we were going to be driving through rainy, whiteout conditions in an entire drive. It just meant for this portion. So I think as a boards need to be just as agile and nimble to look at what information do we need in this growth period? What are the telltale indicators? And what do we need when there's problems ahead? And like we're starting to see with a lot of uncertainty in the economy, what that fallout may look like, especially around commercial real estate in the office sector for financial institution. What do we need to do, and what should we be looking at? And that's, I think, what boards need to be doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Rafael. Boards have a strategic responsibility. They're not operators of the business, and that's not their job, but they certainly have a responsibility to be looking ahead 6, 12, 18, 24 months and saying, here are things on the horizon. What are we thinking about this? How are we thinking about this as an organization? And back to the scenario kind of analysis, if this were to happen, what might it mean? So one of the examples, and you and I talked about this the other day, but a new data point came out, and I think it was the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, but they said they anticipate by the end of this quarter, Q3, that the excess savings, individual savings that had accrued during COVID will be depleted. If I'm a bank director, any kind of a bank, corporate, business, just individual, whatever it is, I'm going to be thinking, okay, so what does that mean in terms of first of all, how I fund loans going forward. Now, I know loan demand is affected by rates, but we're still making loans. So what does it mean to us? But then what's it going to mean Q2, Q3, Q4 next year? How's that going to play out if, in fact, savings are depleted to pre-COVID levels or even lower than that? What does that mean? What does that tell me that we should be thinking? So I believe that boards have that responsibility. And back to the board packages, this is a pet peeve of mine. It's like barnacles on the bottom of a ship. I have seen so many boards where they still get the same report that somebody asked for in 1968.
Right.
And it's not necessarily meaningful or valuable to them in their responsibility as directors. So I do think we need to move beyond that.
So Dave, the other kind of part that I want to touch on, aside from the boards, is we are starting to see, a kind of a blurring of the lines between risk and compliance. What are those? How those need to be working more holistically together, and then looking at two separate functions of compliance and risk. While they each, do and achieve different functions, they're there together to help an institution and their risk management systems develop and thrive. So I think, again, as we start talking about this more and more, we're already starting to see that in a lot of institutions. Like, well, I don't really understand the difference between compliance and audit. Well, we have to understand and go back to the basics. What are they there for and what do they do? But they're all part of that risk management function. When you're within that institution and you're working side by side, it may seem, oh, well, we're looking at similar things, but we're looking at them for different things and in different ways.
Right, right. I like to contextualize it around the first, second, third lines of defense, because while there are certainly similarities, excuse me, between the risk role, the compliance role, the audit role, there are some similarities. There's common threads. They are different. And so, like we were saying earlier, everybody has a leadership role in the organization. I believe everyone has a risk management role. Every job, it's inherent in your job. If you're a frontline banker, doesn't matter what kind of banker it is, you are that first line of defense. So risk management is part of your job. Risk is how you understand the exposure that the firm has. Compliance is what are the regs, what are the policies that our firm has developed to manage to those regs, and then how do we apply that to this specific situation? So in the first line, you have a responsibility to be a risk manager and do so in a compliant fashion. But then I look at compliance, and you're the expert on this, but I look at compliance as being in that second line to observe what's happening in the first line and see how well we're following the regs vis-a-vis our policies. And audit is that truly independent third line of defense, but all have to work in harmony. How did I do on the test, Professor?
You did great on that. And one of the things that, and it's ironic that you and I have not discussed this, because the three lines, of defense has evolved as well in its thinking, and it's now just kind of they're referring it to as the three lines model, because defense kind of infers reactive position versus proactive. And so what they've really done is kind of grouped the first line and second line together as those are management responsibilities. And so we still have those kind of first line roles of, who are the people within the institution that are getting things done. But that second line, I like the way they talk about it now, because it revolves around expertise, support, monitoring, and challenge on risk-related matters. And that, again, shows that the thinking is evolving. And the third line is really the independence and assurance objectives and advice on matters related to the achievement of those objectives and strategic objectives, and how you're dealing with it. So it's hard because I still refer to them as the three lines of defense, but also going to be doing a webinar on this. And so I've had to learn to kind of adapt my thinking, but the more that I've read on it gets to this. And I love the fact that you and I could talk about it without even having planned it.
Yeah. So I made copious notes because I want to use the right nomenclature going forward. So the three lines model, drop defense. I agree that's reactive. So I'm glad I came to today's webinar.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to, what we're kind of looking at next. Why does that agility matter?
So here are just a few thoughts on it. First and foremost, you could break this down into supply and demand, but clients, customers of institutions are changing. Think of their expectations, not only for a financial services provider, but just for any service provider today. We've all been Amazoned.
Right.
Everybody sort of sets a standard based on Amazon. When I was a kid, long ago, I was in the record of the month club. And you ordered the record and you got the record in like 4 weeks. Can you imagine telling a teenager that if there's a song they want, they've got to wait 4 weeks? They're saying, I don't want to wait 4 seconds. If it's not on Spotify, it doesn't exist. But our clients are changing. Technology is changing. The competitive environment always changing. We're talking about in financial services, institutions that we used to think of as retailers that are now in payments business. They're in the loan business. So that's always changing. This is something we can't overlook. Our team members are changing. Our team members are people. What they expect of the organization is changing. We've got to be able to speak to what our team members need if we expect to attract people to our industry, and we're competing for talent. I saw this data point earlier this week that with the infrastructure work that's going on in the country, there is a shortage of 500,000 construction workers. I mean, can you believe that? So if we think that we're only competing with other banks or credit unions for talent, I don't think so. I think we're competing with everyone for talent. I'm not saying necessarily that construction workers want to work in financial institutions or vice versa, but people coming out of school are saying, what are my options?
Right.
So I think that, what team members expect is changing. Certainly regulations are changing. So all of this sort of tells us we've got to be agile, adaptive to the environment. The reason I show the example of Palm, Palm started out strong. They
Right.
were the leader in the personal digital assistants, the PDA world, until they weren't, because they failed to recognize that new standards were being set. The iPhone came out and it could do so much more, that the technology was changing, their competitors were changing, what people wanted was changing. And this notion, I mean, think about it, 30 years ago, people would have thought, okay, for photos, I have a camera. For a phone, I have a phone. Who would have
Right.
known that we're going to make the decision on the next phone we get based on how many pixels the camera has in it? How does that land on you, Rafael?
No, it's very much so. And in fact, just this morning, and I'm walking back from the my workout, I'm looking at the ABA banking journal, and there was an example in there of one of the banks who has kind of been forward looking at how they're doing their marketing and who their next generation of customers were going to be, and moving into areas that again. TikTok and other venues that younger people and that dynamics are facing on that I typically don't see, banks kind of working in that space. We're starting to see more and more of them. But I think, again, it highlighted this one, particular institution and what they're doing to try to anticipate what do those changes look like, again, in your customers, in your clients, who you're dealing with, what technology is changing, how you're doing it with it. And then the last point that I'll make is, again, having dealt with regulations on the other side and evaluating how banks are implementing it, we're never going to get away from what regulations are doing. But I think that while most people can react to them, having that kind of agility competency, and thinking, all right, this is what we have to do. Things are often telegraphed that here's what's coming. And banks and any financial institution should be working towards addressing those issues. It is ever going to be perfect? No, but it's a start. And you're not, again, we may be able to fight some things. We're not going to be able to fight everything, but those are intended for a reason to help address problems or practices or abuses.
Yeah, I agree. I think that our ability to understand what it means to our firm, to our customers, clients, team members, it's just absolutely essential. I want to also, though, so in this context, think about some of the companies that folks that are watching, that are listening, might think about when they think about agile companies, right? Think about a company like Amazon, and in reality, how many different companies Amazon has been since it started out as a bookseller. We order socks and underwear for Amazon today. We order our groceries from Amazon today. We order everything. The concept of Uber or Meta today, and how adaptive they are. Look at Threads, and who knows in the long run how successful Threads will be, but they are a competitor to X, formerly known as Twitter, and they went from 0 to 100 million users in like a week. So think about how adaptive they are, but then how agile their competitors have to be. And so I'm not saying all of these companies would come up on your list, but there's some that I think of when I think of agile companies. They're adaptive, they're always changing, and they face some of the same things we do. Their customers are changing, their regulations are changing, their environment's changing. So I think that it helps us to look sometimes outside of our industries to get examples of firms that are demonstrating some of the characteristics that we might want to bring into financial services.
But I think it also brings up a really good point when you look at some of these larger institutions, is we forget and don't always notice what's going on behind the scenes. What are those subtle changes? And I mean, again, for us to go back and look like, what did, Amazon look like, and where are we now? And then thinking of companies like Blockbuster, that were all the rage when I was in college, and then how that changed, and how Netflix and all these other companies are changing it. But it's any financial institutions, how they upgrade their systems, what are they doing to improve their customer experiences? Those are the things that are seen and just taken for granted, but I don't think all customers realize the amount of work and time and effort and expense that went into improving that customer experience because of what we're seeing in other areas.
Yeah. I suspect that people sitting around the table at some of these companies, they're not worried about what's going to be the next thing. They're taking a look at Gen Alpha,
right?
The kids that are still being born right now, and saying, what's going to matter to them? What's going to be important? What's going to be relevant? And how do we create things that will engage with Gen Alpha? Gen Z, they're already programmed, right? They're the seniors on campus right now. So I just think there's some really great learnings we can take from some of these other industries, other areas.
So as we begin to start wrapping up, what are some of those key questions around agility that you've described in your article and I'd like you to address?
So here's just a short list of questions, but I think these are things that can really be meaningful for a team to ponder. Whether it's just an individual team or it's the whole company, but these are things, and if you think back to even the definition that I offered or the definition that McKinsey offered around what agility means, the first thing I would say is rate your own agility, your company's agility. How do we rate today? Are we very agile? Are we a little agile? Are we really not agile at all? Do we sit and grimace every time we're going, oh my gosh, there's a new reg? Oh no, they're going to do an upgrade to the core. What are we going to do now? That kind of thing. Or are we really agile? Are we doing those things, monitoring the external, monitoring the internal, inferring what it means? How agile are our competitors? When we look across our industry, who do we look to and say, that bank, that credit union, that institution, they're really leading the way in terms of navigating this changing environment? What differences exist between our agility and our competitors' agility? So what are the points of difference? Is it that they're adapting more quickly to the regulatory environment? An example that I love is, and this is not in our business, but I think it's really a good example, when the FAA allowed cell phones to be left on during flights. So I don't remember what year it was. It was probably 8 or 10 years ago. That week I had probably 7 or 8 flights and on 3 different airlines. Airline number 1, which was my primary airline, I won't say what it is, but it was a big one, is a big one. And so the day the announcement comes out, they said, there is a new rule on cell phones. You'll be able to leave them on, but we haven't analyzed it yet, so we aren't sure what to do. So leave your phones off. The next flight I had that day was on another airline, another big airline. Same thing. There's an adjustment in the regs, but don't turn your phones on. The third flight was on a third big domestic airline. They didn't even mention it, not a word. The fourth flight that week was on Southwest. They said, there's a new rule that has to do with leaving your cell phones on. So all you have to do is turn your phone on airplane mode. And if you've never done it before, here's what you do. Every one of them had the same rule book to play by. But one of them said, okay, we aren't going to sit and ponder our navels for a month. Let's just go ahead and do what we do. We're agile. So what are they doing? What are the differences? Customer impact. How does our current level of agility impact the people that we serve? If we're very agile, how does it benefit them? If we're not very agile, how does it disadvantage them? How does it place them at risk? Similar question with our employees. How does our current level of agility impact our employee experience? Now, I want to underscore this. The way that you present your agility competency has a lot to do with the way that it lands on your teams. For organizations who sort of have this mindset of, here we go, another change, something new, something different, stuff's always changing, that doesn't sit as well as saying, we're agile. We understand that our environment's dynamic, and this is the next chapter in our story. So how does that impact your employees? What are the risks if we have low levels of agility? What are the risks that are associated to our company? I think we could focus on some institutions that weren't terribly agile, let's say to adjusting to a rising rate environment, and the outcome there was not very good. But what are the risks for us if we're not agile as an organization? And then what needs to change to improve our organizational agility? Well, what would you add to that, Rafael?
I would say, as you and I frequently talk about how this gets back to culture, it changes that mindset, and it's not something that just starts overnight, but what does this build? And those that are kind of building a strong culture, I think, again, having that agility and nimbleness is key in terms of how people address and assess problems and or the environment that they're in and or competitors.
Yeah. Agree. Totally agree.
So as we wrap up, can you kind of give us some kind of takeaways in terms of, change leadership and this, competency of agility?
Sure. So there is a reason. I gave you some examples of why agility matters, but there's a goal here, and that is to move into this space of change leadership, recognizing that the world is always in motion, our business is always in motion, and that navigating change is essential for effective leadership. Nobody told us when we were in school that if we were in an organization, we were going to have to be good at leading change, but let's acknowledge it right now. It is a core competency for any leader. If you don't feel that you are strong in this area of acumen now, I would suggest one of your mid-year goals is work on developing your change leadership acumen. There's always choices. We can initiate preemptive change, or we can react to things that are change-inducing in the environment. One feels a lot better than the other. You get to choose. Do you want to have your colleagues help read the external, the internal environment and say, here's what we can do now to adapt to this changing environment? Or do you want to wait until you don't have a choice? I suggest preemptive change is better, and that's part of change leadership. Change management is really reactive to conditions. It's saying something happened, now we got to do something. On the other hand, change leadership is a proactive mindset. We're always monitoring. internally, externally, and we're making the changes that we need to make. And last but not least, change leadership requires agility. And that's what we've been talking about. These are not things that you're born with. These are things you can learn as leaders in organizations. The more agile you are, the greater your change leadership acumen.
This journey, this discussion began with me reading the article that you have in SmartBrief, and I look forward to when your articles come out. But that term, change leadership, really caught me. And the idea of developing agility as a competency that says, oh, I think this is something that really should be shared with others because it goes beyond change management. And I think that's why you and I started talking about why do we want to talk about the leadership journey and why it's important for us within wherever we are in the organization. We all have leadership responsibilities. We all, I gave you that example with that dedication and passion and taking the initiative are just some of those key attributes of those competencies. But I really like how that frames because it does help in terms of building a culture that we're building leadership competencies and not just, oh, I need to react to these events.
Yeah. Yeah, my comment on the cultural element is I love Peter Drucker's comment that culture eats strategy for lunch. If you don't have the culture, you can have the best strategy in the world and it really doesn't matter. And that's from a fellow whose profession was strategy. So it really makes a difference. And all these are cultural elements that we're talking about.
Well, Dave, I certainly thank you. And in closing, I just want to say that remember that developing agility leadership is an ongoing journey. It's not just something that happens today or I'm going to do this tomorrow. It's your commitment to growth is your compass, I believe. And, using that compass, one of the analogies I use frequently is just like a captain navigating uncharted waters, embrace the waves of change with confidence. I love your example and analogy of Peter Drucker. One of the things that came to mind is Gandhi's quote, be the change you wish to see. So dare to be the change that brings agility and transformation to yourself and to the institutions and to the people you're around. Embrace empowerment, development, and the core values of a remarkable leader. And thank you.
Love it. Thanks for having me, Rafael. Great seeing you.
Anytime. Definitely, Dave. Have a great day.
You too.